Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
It's great to be here.
Today we're tackling a real classic, a work that grapples with that age-old tension between individual freedom and the limits that society puts on us.
Yeah, a topic that never seems to lose its relevance, does it?
Not at all. And what struck me right off the bat was the dedication. The author dedicates this work to his wife, Harriet Taylor Mill.
And that dedication, it's more than just a romantic gesture. It hints at a really fascinating intellectual partnership.
Right, because Harriet wasn't just his wife. She was a thinker, a writer, someone who deeply influenced his work.
Which was pretty radical for the time. Victorian England women's intellectual contributions were often dismissed or just plain ignored.
So to have this prominent thinker openly acknowledging his wife's influence, that's a powerful statement.
It really is. And it makes you wonder how much their relationship shaped the ideas we're going to be diving into. The author's whole argument hinges on this idea of challenging the status quo when it comes to liberty.
So what's the core argument? What's the big idea he's putting forward?
Basically, he argues that individuals should have absolute freedom over their own lives and thoughts, as long as they're not harming others.
Okay, but that sounds pretty simple on the surface. I mean, who gets to decide what harm even means? Where's the line between personal freedom and the well-being of everyone else?
And those are exactly the questions he tackles. He doesn't shy away from the tough stuff. For example, he goes after this concept of the tyranny of the majority.
Tyranny of the majority. So even in a democracy where the majority rules, there's still a danger of oppression.
Exactly. He's saying that even with good intentions, the majority can still steamroll over the rights of those who hold different views.
It's like he saw our modern world coming with social media and cancel culture and all that. It feels so relevant.
It really does. It's like he anticipated the pitfalls of this interconnected world we live in.
But, okay, let's take this idea of individual liberty to its extreme. Wouldn't that just lead to chaos? If everyone's just doing whatever they want all the time, where does the author draw the line?
Well, that's where his harm principle comes in. He says the only justification for limiting someone's freedom is to prevent harm to others.
Okay, so I can do whatever I want as long as I'm not hurting anyone else. But what if my actions are seen as offensive or immoral by some, even if they're not directly harming anyone?
That's a great question, and he addresses it head-on. He says, look, societal disapproval or offense shouldn't be enough to restrict someone's freedom. He's making a distinction between actions that cause real harm and those that just rub people the wrong way.
So he's emphasizing concrete harm rather than like subjective interpretations of morality.
Exactly, and this is where it gets really interesting. He dives into the whole free speech debate. He argues that even opinions we find offensive or even dangerous should be allowed to exist.
That's a pretty radical idea, especially these days when there's so much talk about censoring certain viewpoints.
It definitely challenges our assumptions, but he's saying that if we really want to progress as a society, we can't be afraid of ideas that make us uncomfortable. Silencing dissenting voices, even those we disagree with, ultimately holds us back.
So even wrong opinions can serve a purpose. They force us to examine our own beliefs and make sure we're not just blindly accepting things.
Exactly. He compares suppressing opinions to assuming we have absolute certainty, which is a pretty dangerous position for fallible humans to take, right?
Makes me think about those echo chambers we all find ourselves in sometimes, whether it's online or in our own social circles. If we only surround ourselves with people who agree with us, we're missing out on that friction that helps us grow.
Right. It's like he's advocating for this intellectual courage, the willingness to face ideas that challenge our comfort zones.
So it's not about agreeing with everything you hear, but being open to hearing it, understanding it, engaging with it, even if it makes you squirm a little.
Exactly. And to drive this point home, he actually delves into history. He uses examples like Socrates and Jesus.
Figures who were condemned in their own time for their beliefs, right? They challenged the status quo and they paid the price.
But look at them now. They're revered for their courage and their ideas. It makes you think about how future generations will judge some of the things we consider taboo today.
So maybe we should be a bit more hesitant to silence voices just because they challenge our current understanding of the world.
That's what he's urging us to do. Be mindful of history. Be wary of those who want to control what we think.
So just to recap what we've covered so far, the author is arguing for maximum individual liberty limited only by the harm principle. He believes that open exchange of ideas, even the ones we hate, is essential for progress.
That's a great summary. He's warning us about this tyranny of the majority, reminding us that even democracies can become oppressive if they don't protect individual rights and encourage dissent.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack.
There is, and what's amazing is how relevant these ideas feel even though they were written so long ago. It speaks to our human need for freedom, our desire to challenge the norm.
I'm already eager to dive deeper. But for now, we'll have to wrap up this first part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive. Last time we were discussing how the author argues that even dangerous opinions shouldn't be silenced.
Yeah, and it really got me thinking, like, how does that actually play out in the real world? Are there any limits at all?
That's where things get really interesting. He uses a kind of surprising example to illustrate this point: dietary restrictions based on religious beliefs.
Dietary restrictions. Okay, now I'm curious. Tell me more.
So imagine a society where the majority is Muslim and they decide to ban pork altogether. No one's directly harmed by someone else eating pork, but it goes against the deeply held beliefs of the majority.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It makes me uncomfortable to think about imposing someone's religious beliefs on everyone else like that.
And that's exactly the author's point. He would say that even if the majority finds something offensive, as long as it doesn't directly harm others, it shouldn't be banned. Things like what you eat, those are personal choices.
So even if it's something that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, like certain religious practices that others might find offensive, he'd still argue for tolerance.
Absolutely. He draws a pretty clear line. He says, societal pressure or legal force shouldn't be used to enforce conformity when it comes to personal beliefs or lifestyle choices.
So it's about creating a society that's really comfortable with differences, even ones that challenge deeply held beliefs.
He sees this diversity of thought and action as a strength, not a weakness. It's about embracing individuality.
But how do you reconcile that emphasis on individual liberty with the need for some kind of social order? You can't just have everyone running around doing whatever they want, right?
Right, and he acknowledges that. He understands that some rules are necessary for a society to function, but he argues that those rules should be minimal, focused on preventing harm, not dictating how people should live.
So finding that balance between freedom and responsibility, individuals are free to make their own choices, but they're accountable for the consequences if those choices harm others.
Exactly. It's this delicate dance between individual freedom and the common good. He believes in empowering people to make their own decisions, even if they make mistakes along the way.
It makes me wonder about his views on government. If he's so wary of societal overreach, I imagine he's even more skeptical of government power.
You're right on the money. He has this deep distrust of concentrated power, no matter who holds it. He believed the best way to protect individual liberty is to limit the scope of government as much as possible.
So less government is always better in his view.
Well, he wasn't advocating for anarchy. He believed government had a role to play, protecting individual rights, providing essential services. But he was very concerned about government becoming too intrusive, stifling individual initiative.
So again, it's about finding that right balance. Government's there to protect people from harm, ensure a fair society, but it shouldn't be micromanaging their lives.
Exactly. He saw the ideal government as more of a referee, ensuring fairness, protecting basic rights rather than dictating every aspect of how people live.
And I think this idea of limited government still resonates with a lot of people today, especially those who are wary of government overreach.
Absolutely. But what's really interesting is that he didn't just advocate for less government. He also had some pretty radical ideas about how government should be structured to prevent tyranny.
Okay, now that sounds like a rabbit hole I want to go down.
Okay.
What did he have in mind?
He was a big believer in democratic institutions, but he also recognized their potential to become oppressive, if the majority silences the minority. So he proposed a system with safeguards to protect individual rights and minority opinions.
Okay, so how would that work? How do you prevent the tyranny of the majority in a democratic system?
Well, he was a strong advocate for checks and balances. Sound familiar?
Yeah, that's a core principle of the U.S. system, the separation of powers.
Exactly. And his ideas definitely had an influence on the Founding Fathers. They saw in his work a model for creating a government that was powerful enough to protect individual rights, but also limited enough to prevent tyranny. They were very aware of the dangers of concentrated power.
It's fascinating how ideas that were considered radical centuries ago have become so fundamental to modern democracies.
It really speaks to his foresight and the enduring appeal of his vision for a free and just society.
But even with these safeguards in place, there's still this tension between individual liberty and the needs of society. How do we navigate that? Where do we draw the line?
That's the question that runs through all of his work. And he doesn't offer easy answers. But he emphasizes the importance of vigilance, constantly questioning and challenging the status quo. He wants individuals to be active participants in shaping their own destiny and resisting attempts to limit their freedom.
So it's not just about having the right laws in place, it's about a mindset, a commitment to individual liberty as a core value.
Exactly. He believed that the pursuit of liberty is an ongoing process, something that each generation has to grapple with and fight for.
It makes me think about some of the specific areas where individual liberty is being debated today, like freedom of speech in the age of social media. How would his ideas apply to this new landscape?
That's a great question, and it's one we're going to delve into in the final part of our deep dive. We'll explore how his principles might apply to the challenges of our digital age, where technology is constantly reshaping the boundaries of individual freedom and social control.
I can't wait to hear your insights. But for now, we'll wrap up part 2 of our exploration. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive. It's been quite a journey exploring these radical ideas about individual liberty.
Yeah, and I think some people might find the author's vision a bit idealistic. A society where even offensive or unconventional opinions are protected, it sounds almost utopian.
It definitely challenges a lot of our assumptions. But I'm curious, is there anything about today's world that the author might actually be optimistic about when it comes to individual liberty? I mean,
That's a good question. While I'm sure he'd have concerns about things like the erosion of privacy or the rise of cancel culture, I think he'd also be encouraged by the progress we've made in some areas. Like social tolerance, individual rights.
could you give us some examples? What kind of progress are we talking about?
Well, think about the advancements in LGBTQ plus rights, gender equality, racial justice. These are all areas where the author's arguments for individual liberty and freedom from discrimination have had a real impact.
That's true. He was a strong advocate for equal rights, no matter who you are or what you believe in. He believed everyone deserves the chance to live a fulfilling life free from unnecessary restrictions and prejudice.
Exactly. And while we still have a long way to go, the progress we've made since his time is undeniable. I think he'd see it as proof that his ideas about individual liberty and social justice are taking root.
It's good to think that his vision of a more just and equitable society is becoming a reality.
Yeah.
But like you said, we're not there yet. And he was a realist. He knew that the fight for liberty never really ends.
You're right. He always emphasized the importance of staying vigilant. He argued that individuals need to be on guard against attempts to limit their freedom, whether it comes from the government, the majority, or any other powerful group.
So we can't just sit back and assume that things will keep getting better on their own.
Exactly. He'd probably say we need to be active in protecting our freedoms and pushing for greater justice.
Which brings us back to that tension between individual liberty and the needs of society.
Yeah.
How do we balance our desire for freedom with the reality that we live in a community and have responsibilities to others?
That's the age-old question, isn't it? And it's one he wrestled with throughout his work. He didn't have all the answers, but he did offer a framework for thinking about it.
Remind us what that framework looks like. How did he approach this dilemma?
Well, it all comes back to the harm principle. The idea that the only legitimate reason to restrict individual liberty is to prevent harm to others. That principle acts as a guidepost when we're trying to figure out where freedom ends and responsibility begins.
So basically, we should be free to live our lives as we see fit, as long as we're not hurting anyone else. But that sounds a lot easier in theory than in practice.
It definitely is. It requires us to really think things through, weigh the consequences of our actions, be willing to compromise when necessary. It's not about absolute freedom or absolute control. It's about finding that sweet spot where individual autonomy and the common good can coexist.
A constant balancing act that requires open communication and a willingness to engage in difficult conversations.
Absolutely. And he believed that a society that values both liberty and responsibility can accomplish incredible things.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by how much the author's ideas still resonate today. Even though he was writing centuries ago, his work speaks to the challenges we face in our own time.
It really does. It's a testament to his understanding of human nature and his belief in the power of reason. He wanted us to be critical thinkers, to challenge the status quo, to never stop questioning the world around us.
He reminds us that the pursuit of liberty is a never-ending journey, one that demands courage, vigilance, and a willingness to engage in thoughtful debate.
And maybe most importantly, he leaves us with a sense of hope. Hope that by embracing individual liberty while recognizing our responsibilities to each other, we can create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
That's a message worth holding on to. Thank you for guiding us through this deep dive. It's been a truly thought-provoking experience.
My pleasure. I hope our listeners will take these ideas and keep exploring them. The conversation about liberty never really ends, does it?
It doesn't.
Yeah.
And on that note, we'll bring this deep dive to a close. Keep those conversations going. Keep questioning. Keep challenging. And keep the spirit of liberty alive.